Hello, everyone, and welcome. This is the Horizon Project BridgeGap, and this is our seminar Anti-Corruption in Progress, where we discuss work in progress and new developments in our discipline across our Horizon projects, BridgeGap, Respond, and of course with friends and collaborators. And we are very glad to be joined today by two such people who actually have a brand new research center funded by a grant of the kind Swiss Research Council, and with whom we are very much connected, both in this project and in our sister project Respond. I'm talking about Professor Emanuela Ceva from University of Geneva and of Professor Maria Paola Ferretti from University of Mainz. And not only the two of them have a new center, but I'll let them explain to you a little bit how this new center will connect with our two projects, because we do seem to have a lot of people in common. But also they have a still new book from Oxford University Press. And I'm introducing to you two political theorists. So today, in a very empirical bridge gap, today it's a more exceptional day when we discuss concepts. But this is timed with the fact that we have just published the concepts and methods first deliverable in BridgeGap, where we explain our specific conceptual approach to the issue of corruption. So it's actually an excellent moment to have two experts on political theory for a change and listen a little bit to their perspective, and then try to discuss and come to some common agreement over the extraordinary explosion of vocabulary in both media, policy, and everyday life of the past 10 years. So welcome, and I would like to start with whom I would like to start. Who actually volunteers to be the first? Emanuela, do I start with you?
I can go first, sure.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alina. So I'd just like to share a few slides we have prepared. So I hope you can see them. Alina, can you just...
Forgive me just a second. I am a very bad moderator. I was instructed to tell by our organizers that this presentation is recorded. So if somebody is against being recorded, you can either disconnect or notify me on the chat. If not, we would presume that everybody agrees and we will record this conversation. Thank you, and back to Professor Ceva.
Okay, wonderful. So thank you very much for this invitation and the opportunity to discuss concepts of corruption, as Alina was saying, in the middle of a burgeoning of studies and media alerts to the spread and perhaps the stretch of this phenomenon across various forms of institutional dysfunction. As Alina mentioned, Maria Paola and I direct the newly constituted Geneva Research Center for Corruption Studies. The Research Center for Corruption Studies, it's a center for research, training, teaching, and networking around the concept of corruption, which aims primarily to encourage cross-disciplinary exchanges. So exactly the kind of exchanges we are entertaining today across various fields in the academic study of corruption, but also to build a bridge with more practitioners-inspired uses of corruption in the media, and also people's perception of corruption. The idea is therefore that to offer a platform for inquiry and policy engagement which rests on rigorous but accessible academic standards that promote an understanding of the manifold forms that corruption can take across different political, institutional, social, and cultural context, and developed training and outreach activities aimed exactly to tailor the understanding of corruption instruments, but also the instruments for devising anti-corruption policies to the concrete specificities of the various forms that corruption may take across democracies, but also at the boundaries of democracies, in authoritarian states, in public institutions, but also the boundaries of public institutions, looking also at corruption in business corporations and across the nonprofit sectors and philanthropic activities. We do that by building synergies among Swiss-based international scholars. So as Alina mentioned, there are quite a few scholars involved in the BridgeGap project, but also in the Respond project, that are either fellows of the center or member of its advisory board. So we hope this is just one of the many conversations we'll be having in the future. And one of the flagship activities we are building up and try to develop are training activities specifically aimed at, on the one hand, public office holders to develop an ethics of office, a sense of what it means to be exposed to risk of corruption, and on the other hand, civic education programs in order to train citizens to hold institutions accountable for what they do with the power of office. So I mentioned these two elements, so an ethics of office for public servants on the one hand, and citizens' awareness and engagement in accountability on the other. And I did that with a specific aim in mind, which is to introduce our own specific angle on political corruption, which, as Alina mentioned, was presented in its first version, as it were, in a book published by Oxford University Press 4 years ago now. The book builds on theories of public ethics, which is the discipline that looks at to the principles that ought to inform the conduct of those who hold office in public institutions, and analytical studies in political theory, precisely to ask the question that from which we started earlier on in the introduction. So there are many different usages of corruption. Corruption is being used to indicate such traditional, if you wish, phenomena as bribery, embezzlement, all those issues where there is one or a series of rotten individuals, the bad apples, that use public power for private benefit, which aligns with the traditional definition of corruption, also used by Transparency International. And on the other hand, more recent development in institutional theory, pointing at institutional corruption as a specific phenomenon, referring to rotten institutions that are ill-designed. And here we can think of regulation of lobbies, private financing of electoral campaigns. So in the debate, these two phenomena have been treated as indicating two separate forms of corruption. What we try to do in the book is to present what we think is the common root of corruption. So in either its individual and institutional manifestations, at the root of corruption, that's the argument we present, there's always at least one office holder that makes a use of the power entrusted to the role in a way that is unaccountable with reference to the terms of their mandate. We have that with bribery. I use my power of office to accrue to my own personal benefit. Nepotism, I use my power of office to favor family and friends, but also lobbyism, when I use my position and my contacts to put forward an agenda that responds to the private rather than the public. So in the book, we present this common root of corruption as what we call a deficit of office accountability. And on the other hand, we propose an ethics of office accountability, which sees at the core of anti-corruption the enhancement of accountability practices through which office holders are responsibilized to make a conscious use of their power of office in a way that can be vindicated by reference to their own mandate. This means that anti-corruption and definition of corruption themselves cannot and should not be reduced to legal definitions, And anti-corruption should not simply be seen as a matter of punishing rotten individuals or changing institutional rules, but promoting an ethics of office that is capable of mobilizing the internal resources that institutions have to counteract corruption from the inside. And at this point, I would just like to give the floor to Maria Paola to continue and tell you something more in terms of the specific angle we take on institutions that informs our approach to corruption.
Yeah, so what is distinctive of our approach and also what can bring to a center on corruption? So we see there are synergies of what we bring to this forum of different centers and groups of scholars working on corruption. So our focus is on the human side of institutions. So we have say, okay, our conception of institution is a conception that puts the office holders at the center. So the people who occupy the roles in the institution are at the center of our reflection. And of course, there is an immaterial part of the institution that is done by rules, is done by mechanism, and we take them seriously. But what we think is really important is the focus on the work of office holders and on their responsibility. So in this sense, we think that corruption is a sort of Trojan horse that affects the institution from within. So there is no way to design institution in a way that's impermeable to corruption. And at the same time, we have to pay attention to the interest, to motivation, to the incentive that we give to the people, to the emotion to the people. So also when we conceive projects of corruption, project of interest, consider all these aspects, that is the human work. And also when we talk about institutional work, we talk always of people working within the institution. The way we conceive of institutional action is the interrelated action of institutional members or occupants of roles within the structure of an institution. And these are important implication for the ways, for example, we conceive different means for anti-corruption. So, for example, the application of artificial intelligence or machine learning that very often are used as a way to substitute humans in their weakness, in the approach to the public administration, for example. And what we want to bring at the core of our research, in general, the project that we will host in this center is exactly that we should retain this moral responsibility and the responsibility that is given to persons occupying roles. So to conclude, we have a platform for rigorous inquiry and policy engagement. So these are all themes that are really important, but if we have to specify a focus, is a focus on political corruption as a deficit of accountability. So accountability is very central to our inquiry, and a focus on this human component, and so the inquiry into the people who are really the main character of corruption practice, even when they take an institutional dimension. And I leave it here. We have time for discussion.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Maria Paola. Okay, so first I will, before explaining a little bit the concepts in BridgeGap and briefly, I will first throw a question to you. I think Emanuela started by saying that what you do is that you bridge a little bit this institutional with the individual aspects of corruption. But in the end, when I listen to you, I have the impression, however, that the discussion is at the individual level, because you are telling us that individual choice matters. And what you're looking at, it's a priority for you, is to look at personal motivations of individuals, right, in an organization. We will mediate this later, but just briefly to say, since we come from different disciplines, okay, what does political theorists call institutions? We political scientists and economists we call organizations, okay? What we call institutions are just the rules. But there is just a difference of semantics, you know, there is really a superficial difference, but I have often seen this creating a lot of confusion. Okay, so if an individual matters within an organization, right? Say Siemens, to give a famous example, right? That presumes that that there is no institutional corruption, that there is no decision by the head of the department that we basically pay a bribe on every contract that we go, and that the individual himself has a choice, which seems to me to indicate that your stress is individual. And in direct relation with this question, I would ask you what the geographical focus is. Because again, if the individuals matter so much, this seems to indicate contexts in which the norm, the public norm is, however, ethical or public integrity, and that is unchallenged. Okay, so this seems to indicate, although I don't know it is unchallenged, we started the discussion with United States, it's in our title. Okay, but this, however, seems to indicate a bit more developed contexts rather than developing contexts.
Okay, yeah, can I start?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay, now I start with the individuals and you carry on with the geographical aspect. So for the individual is exactly our challenge, that we think that institutional action is done by individual action in interrelatedness. So this idea of interrelatedness does a lot of work in our theory. Why? Because the idea is that when we act within an institution, which is a specific kind of organization in our vocabulary, we act together with the others. So we cannot do our tasks within an institution. We cannot act in our role without taking into consideration the other roles. So there are hierarchies, so there are people taking decisions, there are people obeying orders, but at the same time, individuals retain their responsibility, retain choice to a certain extent. And the fact that individuals are so important, and in a way there is a unit that is this individual unit, doesn't mean that we look only at individuals disconnected. So we look at patterns of interrelatedness, and in fact, in the book, we explain different patterns of interrelatedness, giving some ideal models. So, for example, how the morphology of different institutions influence the work of the single people, that sometimes acts of corruption are derivative of this morphology of teams or institutional groups. But the unit of study is not the group. Yeah? So are individuals in interrelatedness. Maybe Emanuela wants to add something.
Yeah, well, on this point, I think you covered pretty much all the ground we put forward in the book. But it's important also to address the second part of Alina's question, to underscore how the view of institutions we have is, as we mentioned in the presentation, really human-centric. So in order to understand what an institution or an organization is, we also use them interchangeably. I don't read too much into the two terms. It's not sufficient to look at mechanisms, procedures, and statutory regulations, whatever. Institutions are enacted by those who occupy roles. So unless we look at human behavior, we miss on something very important. Of course, as the institutionalists say, it is a problem when institutions are bad designed. But if there are bad rules and no one acts upon that rules, then we have no corruption. To see corruption, we need to look at what people actually do with whatever those rules allow them to do. And this is important for us also because that leads us to connect corruption to accountability. So what is problematic, we found that what is problematic for the point of view of corruption is that people use the power that institutional rules give them in ways that are disconnected from the power mandate that cannot be justified by reference to whatever were the reasons why they had that power. And here I come to answer the question. So in the background, when we wrote the book, we had in mind public institutions of democracies. Democracies that are in generally well-functioning, and when you have corruption materializing from within. Then the challenge we took on with the Margins of Corruption project, which is the project generously funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, you, Alina, mentioned earlier on. We got ourselves to ask the question of whether this view of corruption, which was designed having in mind democratic institutions, could also capture the mechanisms of corruption in hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes. For instance, in the project, I see here in the audience one of the researchers involved in the Margins of Corruption project, Serkan Şeker, who did field work in Hungary and Turkey, exactly looking whether, even in those contexts, we can still associate corruption to a deficit of accountability, or whether, because the mechanisms for distributing power change so much, then we need to revise our definition. And so far, the results are quite encouraging, we must say, in terms of the strength of the definition, also to capture something there. And then we have another part of the research that looks at whether this view of corruption can also travel to the private sector. There's Mathieu Debief works precisely on this part of the research, looking at corruption in non-profit organizations, where the standards of accountability to the public are completely, the expectations of the public toward non-profit organizations are very different from those directed to democratic institutions. So these are the first attempts at extending the study, but as part of the missions of the center, there is also that to expand to different cultural contexts. For instance, we have a project which will be starting soon with the University of, one of the universities in Chile, that wants to look at whether this view of corruption can also travel to South American context with such a different tradition of what public institutions are. So yeah, the jury is still out on whether this view can actually extend, but that's the direction of the research we also would like to promote.
Okay, I see. So your geographical scope is actually changing. You are expanding day by day, or you're trying to expand, from what I understand, but trying to keep the same definition of corruption, which I think it's absolutely very just. But if the same mechanism can resist, here is where I actually have some doubts. And my doubts start at home, to be very honest. I mean, I was looking with my students today or yesterday at this Huawei scandal in the European Parliament. And I didn't realize, it's the first time I look at it closely, I didn't realize that out of the 5 people involved, there are again 3 Italians. There are 3 Italians, 1 Bulgarian and 1 Maltese. And in the preceding Qatar scandal, there were also a real, gang of Italians who are running that racket. And are this, I mean, what would be your hypothesis? These are some really bad individuals from Italy who all end up randomly in the European Parliament because they know it's a great rent to be there, or how does it work?
We actually, sorry.
No, Maria Paola, go ahead. Yes.
No, we actually have written about that, and our take was exactly, it's not just bad apples. So is what happened in the European Parliament was exactly a failure of taking institutional responsibility. But for us, institutional responsibility doesn't mean that there is a spokesperson who comes and say, now we have to fight corruption. The idea will be really to have a retrospective reflection of what happened. So where were the positions vulnerable to lobbying and corruption? So for example, many of the people involved were parliamentary assistants who work for 5 years, and in these 5 years they have to ensure their career for the years after. So part of the corruption was trying to make ensuring a career after this 5 months of mandate. And of course there was more, there were lobby, there were private, and were a lot of gray areas. So we're not just breach of rules. Yeah, so there was a lot of personal relation, long-standing networks, etc. And the failure of the European Parliament reacting to that was, on the one hand, there was the idea, okay, we have to discard the bad apples, and then we should reform the whole system of lobby, but then nothing happened. Why? Because they didn't take seriously what was systematically wrong, and there was no appropriation of the wrong that was going on as an institution, as role occupants in interrelation. So that there was, of course, was the work of single people, but within a structure of interrelation. And the parliament, in this sense, failed to take responsibility in the sense of appropriating what was going wrong and then look for solution after this exercise of looking back to what happened.
Yeah, but maybe the parliament rules work for other people, you know. They seem to work for the Swedes, for the Germans. I haven't heard discussions about them. It's just Italians, Greeks, Romanians, Bulgarians. Some Austrians seem to me to not to be on the good side. But my question really is this institutional corruption? I mean, the fact that the entire subcommittee in the Qatar gate had traveled on Qatar's first class money. I mean, would you call this institutional corruption?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's again that's to problematize the common definition. So, on our understanding, that would be corruption proper, and it is institutional in the sense that it is embedded within an institutional context. It is institutional because these are people acting in their institutional capacity, not in other capacities. But insofar as there is someone who acts in their institutional capacity, meaning using the power or privileges that they have only because they occupy that role within an institution, then corruption is institutional because it tells something not necessarily about the character of the inclinations of the interest of the individual, but something about the pattern of interaction that are in place in the institution. So these cases matter institutionally. So I would probably say that they are institutionally relevant cases of corruption, because by looking at these cases, we learn not only about the specific people involved, but something about the practices established within the institution.
I see it. But also, I'd like to press you a little bit on this one. Practices mean more than one person, right?
Yeah.
So do numbers matter in this definition of institutional? Because now you define institutional corruption just very formally, that it is because using of the institutional entrusted power that person commits a corrupt act. But then that happens, that is common to most public corruption, because this is what these people can trade. They trade the power entrusted to them in the office, right? But and then why do we call it institutional? Because it can be an isolated guy, like the Danish tax fraud guy, who was by himself as they were preparing for digitalization. He remained the only human in the department, and then he defrauded 1 million per hour. Okay, but it can be the entire department or the entire subcommittee, and we speak here. Which do we call all of them institutional corruption because an institution is involved, you know? I feel very closer to your concept of practices. I mean, in our definition, in the moment that I expect when I am somebody who pleads with this committee and I have a case to go there, in the moment when my expectation is that I will have to offer them lavish trips and invite them to lavish restaurants, this is institutional corruption. Okay, the fact that expectations are shaped by what is a majority practice, a dominant practice. And the dominant practice, I expect that I will need to bring some gifts to this committee, or otherwise I won't get a good note. But that actually means it happens regularly. It is a pattern. It is a norm, and hence the distinction which I always try to make between norm and exception. You know, after all, you know, if you watch Emily in Paris, which is a sitcom on Netflix, who watches Emily in Paris, you know, there is this very inviolable list of individuals who change the fashion mode, which is published in Le Monde every month, and everybody wants to get there. And our, very ambitious marketing manager, the heroine, asks, okay, so how to put my clients there? And the answer is you cannot. This woman who's in charge of this, she's a bitch. Nobody can reach her. It's impossible. Okay, so the norm is clearly you cannot use a connection to place yourself in that. Okay, and that is, I think, a distinction that people know, that any journalist, any anthropologist can study. You go somewhere and I ask, okay, can I go and just get electricity without anything, submitting an online application, or do I actually have to budget? Do I actually have to go? Okay, and I call the second in my work institutional corruption, very much in the Acemoglu and Robinson sense. Okay, these are institutions for us which constrain individual behavior because they're collective, they're patterns of behavior, they're the way that things are done, and individuals are simply constrained. This is how it is. And then the second question really remains, where is the level of these institutions? Where are the institutions created? Is it an electricity company? Is it at the committee, is the subcommittee of human rights? And my empirical argument, as well as theoretical, is that unfortunately, so far, the country is the strongest level. And it is difficult, you will probably find country is the context which constrains institutionally individual behavior. It's difficult to find a country which has dirty universities but clean hospitals, which has dirty politicians, but the bureaucracy is clean. Countries tend to be fairly coherent. And this is why I always think that we need an individual approach which works very well where corruption is an exception, and a more sociological, or as economists would say, institutional quality approach to countries where, in fact, the corruption is norm. That is the way of doing business. It is more important than written regulation. It is an informal institution trampling across everything else. So I think that our point of view comes a little bit more from the new democracies, developing world, rather than from established democracies as yours. But I'm interested in hearing how we define corruption at this, also to make a little bit of difference, or I don't know, similarity. Dennis Thompson calls institutional corruption, even if undue profit is not necessarily involved. Simply the fact that an institution, that an organization like the Congress or like the Human Rights Committee is fundamentally different from its constitutional mission. And its constitutional mission, for instance, in this case, would be to give valid certification for human rights for everybody. The fact that you fail to do this systematically due to so many favors that people receive would mean corruption for him, even if people don't take money at home, like the Greek lady, her name was, Mrs. Carli. Okay, and I think that this is stretching a lot the definition of corruption. I understand what he means, but maybe if we call this institutional corruption, so we have three definitions, in my opinion, right now in this conversation of institutional corruption. One is that if some institutional power is involved in this abuse, entrusted power, then it is institutional. Second is mine, that if this act happens regularly, it's a dominant practice that shapes expectations of claimants, is institutional corruption. And the third is that if a bad practice comes which makes the institution different from what it's constitutionally supposed to deliver, then in a Machiavellian sense, all these institutions are corrupt. In other words, they are corrupt from their original meaning, which was integrity, responsibility. So I think, distinguishing between the three, at least to make people understand we're not talking about the same thing, maybe it's useful, because maybe negotiations is too ambitious between the three terms. Please.
Yeah, well, Alina, what you were saying, I think it's really so important, because putting on the table these three definitions, I think it's very helpful to see what is compatible and what is really alternative. Because what I think is totally other from the view of corruption that Maria Paola and I have elaborated is the institutionalist definition Thompson gives. And I think every time I mention in this context Dennis Thompson, I always wish to remind everyone what a great human being he was and how sad it was to lose him a few months ago. And it gave us the opportunity to actually think about the many symbolic ways in which the term corruption was used. And many of the uses of corruption he made are symbolic. Corruption is just a metaphor to say that there is a corrosion, there is some diversion from some original pristine state. That's the way in which this term corruption is used. So what we think institutional mechanisms do is to create opportunities for corruption. But unless someone actually acts on those mechanisms, then you have corruption only in a symbolic sense, but not concrete sense. So I would say that his view of corruption is really alternative. But then I would want to say that the other two views, that is your view concerning more social norms and our view of corruption, are actually aligned. In fact, what you describe as institutional corruption is one of the forms that we think corruption can take in institutional context. So in the book, and this is perhaps Maria Paola can take it from here if she so wishes. We distinguish various different patterns. We identify three main patterns that corruption can take in the institutional context that we call summative, morphological, and systemic. And what you talk about seems to be one of the systemic cases of corruption, but then we also identify institutional corruption through other patterns. So ultimately, what I really wanted to stress is that I think that our view can sort of capture something important that is in your view and the other way around, while I think we should join forces, as it were, to alert to the perils of making metaphorical uses of corruption, because that distracts from the very urgent problems we have otherwise and waters down the rhetorical and policy relevant impact of any corruption discourse we might have. Then I don't know, Maria Paola, if you want to say something more.
Yeah, maybe the question of scale. So is institutional corruption or not? Of course, for us is always institutional corruption. So if we talk of the European Parliament and a case of corruption in the European Parliament, we want to call it institutional corruption. And then we say, well, sometimes it's just an exception, and rightly so. You say, well, maybe if it's really just one exception, is not so deep, is something that can be solved relatively easily by discarding the bad apples, etc. But it's still institutional corruption, and the idea that there might be cases that are more entrenched, and as you say, that maybe there are different patterns, is something that can be studied with empirical studies. So it is really true that Southern European are more corrupt than Northern European. So these are all questions that are legitimate, but don't really affect the definition of institutional corruption, I think, because even the isolated office holder, if he works in the parliament, for example, if he gives a testimony that is false before the European Parliament, the decision of the European Parliament will be the decision that shouldn't have been with a genuine testimony. Yeah. So the whole work of the European Parliament will be affected in a way that I think we should call political corruption. So the idea is that, so obviously, probably if we look at the big picture, you're right to say, yeah, we see some patterns that are more worrying than others, but our conceptualization doesn't exclude that we can say something like that. So in that sense, I think we have good reason to see different patterns of institutional corruption and still recognize it as institutionally relevant in different ways.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that now I caught like a fourth way of defining institutional corruption, which is by its consequences, right? The consequences because the organization then may, which is in a way basically also what Thompson says. But I definitely subscribe on the idea that more precision in the terms, in particular for advocacy, not allowing to consider where we cannot, for instance, prove any undue profit. I had another interesting discussion with my American students today on gun lobby. I mean, there are a lot of borderline situations, and in my opinion, we should keep clear borders. We should keep clear borders, even if we push them far, even if we are demanding in these borders, because if we don't, the risk is that we devalue very much what corruption is not about. And what I like about our approach a lot is the fact that you include and conceive the fact that a lot of corruption is legal these days. Okay, a lot of corruption is in fact, certified, exists in the form of legal privileges which have not been historically eliminated, because I think that the real anti-corruption is not this isolated anti-corruption that we have today against a few individuals or companies, but it is the historical effort to build regimes on the basis of ethical universalism, where integrity is the norm. That is the great effort. And if people would understand that we actually have always gone uphill, they would probably understand better why it is so complicated to clean certain areas. I've seen a good question by Schuller, actually, in which he asks about behavior being agreed upon, and maybe we should include this in the definition. Well, I think that what is interesting in democracies is, in autocracies, it's very clear, people may not agree upon, but they learn to play the game of neo-patrimonialism. Okay, if you have to survive, then you have to learn, and everybody has to be affiliated to a group, to a patron and a group of clients. So I do not know if to call this agreement, okay, but that is where power asymmetry is at its highest in neo-patrimonial regimes, which are not democratic regimes. This is how it works. But how does it work in democracies? I mean, I think in democracies, we have at least two types of democracies. And the most, what I think are my most interesting democracies are a group of about 80 democracies where, in fact, we have systematic corruptions, but in the same time, we have elections. And I think that in countries like this, there is agreement, for instance, across political parties. And this agreement makes it that whoever comes to government actually immediately starts spoiling public resources. For instance, you politicize a lot of institutions, you appoint all your supporters in the boards of publicly owned enterprises. And we shouldn't have to look, to very poor countries. I mean, this happened in Belgium. There was a case even some years ago where the main defense of these two gentlemen who were appointed in the board of companies they knew nothing about, sectors they knew nothing about. Okay, and their defense, when they were appointed by a Belgian party, right, as part of the gift, you win elections, you appoint your friends. And their defense was that, but it has always worked like this. It worked like this under the previous guys. I mean, why are we the first to take the fall? So I think that in countries such as mine, or maybe Brazil, where we have some participants from Brazil in BridgeGap, maybe the expectation across parties is this is how it works. We have a Petrobras. When I am in government, I will exploit the Petrobras resources. When you come, it's your turn, and the rest of it. But what I think is increasingly divergent, even in this 80 group of countries, which I call competitive particularistic countries, because they're clearly based on particulars, but in the same time, there is pluralism. It's not one exploiter. Exploiters compete, and someone wins elections and then starts exploiting, extractive institutions in his benefit. What is interesting is that the public diverges. The public doesn't have, the alignments of the publics are not aligned. I mean, let's say some of the part of the public are clients of parties. They would expect, for instance, that they get allocations for their project more than they would get in the opposition, right? But we have large numbers of people across countries who are in disagreement of this way. And this is, I think, what explains the success of populism, is that political classes still think that they can run this kind of game where they have agreement. This is how it should work in their opinion, okay? We divide the partitocrazia, we divide the goods among parties, and then the public votes some of us in or out. But the public doesn't agree, and populists are there to tell the public, to remind the public that whole political class, not just one party, is playing this game, and that, of course, is very dangerous for our democracies.
No, absolutely. I think our stress on these discursive approaches to corruption points exactly in that direction. So to see where role occupants in institutions, so in a democracy, this includes citizens, can perhaps come in defining these rules. So obviously are not written in stone. So there is no one idea of integrity that is there, and we move from that idea of integrity, as you say. So expectation and rules and practice are developing, and probably anti-corruption is exactly working toward giving a direction to these practices, correcting the bad practices and trying to promote the bad practice. So it's a work in progress. So we don't see, okay, here's the right way to behave, and here, our ideal, and here what we should do to move. So the idea is exactly that practices of accountability should help us to correct what is going wrong, what is no longer perceived as legitimate in the sense that you indicate, or accepted, or that creates expectation, and slowly trying to correct, to improve, to make it straight in the way we want our democracy to go. So I think it's part of the political life, and probably accountability, or these discursive practices of accountability, are our way to come into the same problem.
But here is where I think that, that having these development contexts like in age of democracy, like degree of individual autonomy of voters, voters who cannot be submitted to threats, to punishments, who have some individual autonomy. I think this makes quite a lot of difference. I started in anti-corruption with the parliament. I created a coalition for a clean parliament because I was facing a parliament which was entirely corrupt. Okay, so should we have preferred a dictator to this parliament? But the parliament was entirely corrupt. And of course, we started to think of strategies of regulation and stuff. At the time, one of my Harvard professors told me, this is nonsense, my dear. Parliaments are sovereign. This parliament is corrupt because they want to be. The idea that they're going to pass to you some regulation, you have to just, move the accountability to another level. And what was the other level? Okay, the other level was the voters. And we know that this vertical accountability is difficult, but it was also a clear thing. So, one of the areas in which BridgeGap looks a lot, for instance, we try to evaluate anti-corruption, and by defining corruption in a policy institutional perspective, what we call institutional perspective. So it's a simple policy definition. What is compared to what should be. Okay, how does the public health system behave compared to what the public health should behave constitutionally, right? Or the education, or the members of parliament, or the human rights subcommittee of the European Parliament. And then when we look at solutions, we assess the existing policies, and we assess the existing policies starting by the actor, okay? Because I think frequently in anti-corruption, we entrust the person who is on top of this pyramid of extraction, we entrust him with the policy, okay? I think that this is where institutional corruption is so important, because if I'm at Siemens, if I'm the head of the department and I give all of you bonuses, if you bring contracts and create a budget for your bribes, okay, then I cannot expect myself to regulate myself. You see exactly what I mean. So here is where I think we're going to provide a lot of empirical work to show that there is a very big gap between regulation even in advanced democracies like in European Union. It's tremendous gap, which is not an implementation gap. It's simply a misconception gap. We don't give the power to who would have the interest to change the situation, like the public. Emanuela, please.
Yeah, and besides being the kind of problem, the problem you describe is the key problem of current anti-corruption policies. So this design of rules that, and the expectation that the trick is simply to tighten the application of those rules. So there is a problem of reconceptualizing anti-corruption action in order to target the right agents of anti-corruption, and also and that's part of the mission of the center, some background work in terms of education and training, because one of the very key elements we think should be brought central to anti-corruption is the need to activate institutions' internal resources. And in order to do that, rather than constraining office holders, telling them you are wrong, unreliable, untrustworthy, and therefore we need to reduce your discretion and put you under a straitjacket. In fact, made them protagonists of anti-corruption. But you cannot do that unless you train people to be protagonists in this way. And that's where, to be very concrete, a very serious reconfiguration of ethical training programs, ethical code of conducts must be done. Because at the moment, ethical codes of conduct are simply a collection of rules that people feel very detached to them, another set of straitjackets to which they must comply with no real bite. And training programs are normally offered like, lectures with people sort of patronizing office holders and make them feel guilty for whatever they do in their daily office. While in order to actually promote these ethics of office that we try to foster also with our activities, we need to make ethical codes of conduct, as we call them, identity cards of an institution. So to enhance these deliberative moments where the people that work for the institution are really actively implicated in designing the charter so that they can claim ownership for the charter. And considering these codes not as written in stone once and for all, but make them a continuous work in progress to readapt to changing circumstances, new challenges, to revisit as the people in the institution change, and also training must not simply be a matter of patronizing people into doing things, but in fact in teaching people how to act responsibly, actually to be adults and not like children that needs to be taught how to behave, but give them instruments to make this call for themselves. And so we really think that these two moments are fundamental for any anti-corruption strategy to work. So it's design, but also valorizing the human capital.
Right. Well, this sounds very Swiss to me, to be very honest. Okay. Because the countries where I work on, these people who should be made to feel ownership over ethical codes. So in other words, still a self-regulation approach. These people would be people who actually got there not by merit, but because they are party cronies, they are relatives of someone or something. Okay. So unless you address the core issue, I don't think you can do much by ethical training. But my last questions, because we have to end it here. I followed the chat, but I did not see other questions. I mean, if there were other questions which I missed. The question really is not really a system like the UK current regulation, in which basically somebody who knows about the corruption in organization becomes criminally liable. Is this actually not more effective, this criminalization of knowing and not solving this issue, rather than relying on self-regulation? Because I'm sure the self-regulation approach, making people responsible, might work in Switzerland, okay? Maybe it might work in Germany, but I'm not so sure about other countries.
But Alina, mind you, I've been working in Switzerland only for 6 years, but I'm Italian, and it's precisely because I've worked for Italian universities that I know what I'm saying, that's exactly what is needed, and it's needed precisely where we think it's more difficult to realize. And that's also why we also think that this kind of training must be coupled also with civic education in schools, because unless you change things from the ground, then the kind of mechanisms that you're talking about inevitably will be there. And the criminalization approach can be very helpful in some contexts as a remedial and immediate reaction. No, it's like when you cut yourself, you put a band-aid. But then if the cut is very deep, then the band-aid is necessary, because without the band-aid, you are going to lose too much blood. But after that, you need to go to the hospital and get stitches. And if it becomes evident that the reason why you're bleeding too much is because you have some kind of underlying disease with your blood, then you need to address your root causes. And it comes out that if you have this problem because, for instance, you've had some disease since your childhood or you don't eat properly, then you need to go deeper again and address these causes. So it's really a multi-level and multi-factor dimension. So in complex cases like corruption, I think we can also all agree that there is no one single recipe for a solution, but it's a matter of joint forces and different strategies. And it's a matter of making out of tiny little necessary components a sufficiently comprehensive strategy. Otherwise you get populist, having ready to hand.
And also,
well, only my we have to. I'm afraid we have to conclude and end. I would just recommend. So no, I agree. I don't think Italy is. I mean, you know, we have worse countries than Italy in mind, but I think Italy is a difficult case, and therefore I would like to see this ownership of ethics starting with the members in European Parliament from Italy. This would really, really be, you know, a place to test this and to see if we manage to improve on the current situation. I have to end, not before I invite everybody to the next Anti-Corruption in Progress, which is taking place on October 30. On October 30, for some of us, it will be in person. This is in Louis. So if anybody is in Rome, you are also invited to join us in person. We are going to have two roundtables, one with political scientists to discuss if there is a need for the Europeanization of anti-corruption criminal regulation. And we will also be joined by Italian anti-corruption agency, the ANAC. And the second roundtable would be with criminal law professors who actually discuss if we Europeanize criminal regulation, should it be more like whose regulation? I mean, what is the best goodness of fit in Europe? Because it does seem that countries have very different opinions and the current directive is blocked at the European Council. So I hope that everybody can join us online or in fact on site. We already advertise this on our website in a couple of days. So just write to my colleague, Davide Atanasio, and we hope to see you there. Thank you very much for our guests and for all our participants today. And we hope this is just the first time in many opportunities of discussing and working together. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.